Welcome back, week 6. Today we're going to discuss quantitative research, qualitative research, and mixed method research. Okay, what is quantitative research? So this is a review. We've been through this before. We really wanted to review this again just because at this point you are going to be conducting your research in the next few weeks. So I just wanted to go back into the different characteristics and detailed account of how you're going to put together your research and conduct it. So remember, the objective of quantitative research is to understand a situation, topic, or issue. Quantitative is a numerical type research. It's always going to be with numbers and statistics. Most of the characteristics, the main characteristics are usually that the data is gathered in a more structured type method. The results are based on larger sample sizes that are representative of the population. It can always be replicated or repeated given its high reliability. All aspects of the study are carefully designed before the data is collected, and the data is collected in the forms of numbers and statistics. Researchers use tools such as questionnaires or equipment to collect numerical data. Remember, with quantitative research, we're always looking at the quantity, numerical. This is again a review of the steps in a quantitative study. We have phase 1, the conceptual phase, where you formulate the problem, review the literature. You're going to be doing that around your meta-analysis grid and really fine-tuning the research based around your research topic. You're going to undertake your clinical field work. So this is where you actually do your research. You're going to define the framework, developing conceptual definitions, which we've also talked about, and dealing with picking out the perfect or the appropriate conceptual framework for your particular study. And then you're going to formulate your hypothesis. In phase 2, you're going to select a research design, develop intervention protocols, identify the population, design a sample plan, specify methods to measure the research variables, develop methods to safeguard your subjects. And this is where your city certification comes into play to make sure that you're doing everything ethically with sensitivity towards your patients. And then, of course, finalizing the research plan. Collect your data in phase 3, prepare the data for analysis. Phase 4, analyze the data, interpret the results. And then in phase 5, communicate your findings. And this will all be put into your chapter 1, chapter 2. Okay, data collection in quantitative research. So remember, when you're collecting data in quantitative research, you're looking at your data collection through interviews, questionnaires, and scales. You're going to be doing checklists, rating your responses, and then doing observation and electronic monitoring. Okay, now we have to get into qualitative research. So some of you are doing quantitative research, some of you are doing qualitative. Today in your group work, we're going to actually take your PICO question and put it into both quantitative and qualitative formats to see what would actually be the best research for your particular topic. So in terms of qualitative research, many researchers are more interested in the quality and meaning of a particular activity. This type of research investigates the quality of relationships, activities, situations, or materials that are frequently referred to as qualitative. There's a greater emphasis on a holistic description. So again, this is a review. This graph is in your book. Activities in a qualitative study. Remember, it's more circular, less linear than a quantitative study because things change in terms of people's feelings, and responses. So you may find that you have to, even though you're planning the study a certain way, you may end up having to go back and forth in terms of what you're finding with what they're giving you in their responses. So you may have to adapt your data collection based on what responses you're getting. So in the beginning, you're planning your study, the same thing like quantitative, identifying the research problem, doing your literature review within your meta-analysis, developing an overall approach, selecting and gaining entry into research sites, and developing methods to safeguard participants. Next, you're developing data collection strategies, deciding how you're going to collect the data and who you're going to collect it from. Then you're going to gather and analyze the data, evaluate the data, and then communicate the findings. So what the methods we use to collect data in qualitative research include surveys, observations, interviews, group discussions. A lot of you are going to be doing surveys in your data collection. So we keep encouraging you to do literature reviews to make sure that you find surveys that have already been created, because a lot of times these surveys are actually out there. The research has already been done, and you want to utilize tools that are already in place that have been standardized. So really do your literature reviews, do your research to find surveys that are already in place and see if you can adapt the surveys to collect the data that you're looking for. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. It's too complicated. Okay, some basic comparison examples of quantitative versus qualitative. So just as a little recap to give you an idea of what the difference in information is, I like these little statements because they're pretty basic and give you some basic examples. So quantitative would be much more descriptive. He is 6 feet 7 inches tall versus qualitative. He is tall. Quantitative, they eat 6 meals a day versus qualitative, they eat all the time. Quantitative, the president's approval rating is at 73% versus qualitative, the president is really well liked. Again, quantitative gives you exact numerical data. She saves $2,000 every month versus qualitative, she is good with money. Quantitative, the cruise ship served 3,000 passengers versus the cruise ship was huge. Quantitative, the cat weighs 20 pounds versus the cat is fat in qualitative. So just some examples to remind yourself of when you're reading studies, how you're looking at quantitative versus qualitative. Okay, very important, tools for collecting research data. So now that we're going to start getting into your research, it's important that you really identify what tools you're going to use to collect your data. So in quantitative, we're looking at experiments, questionnaires, surveys, sampling, and census. Versus qualitative, you're looking at focus group discussions, case studies, interactive interviews, and participatory methods. Here is a video on how to collect quantitative and qualitative data.
Hello, my name is Evan Ortlieb, and welcome to another chat about common qualitative and quantitative data collection tools. Today we're going to get into these as they pertain to mixed methods research. So first, let's have a look at different types of qualitative data. Of course, when we think about qualitative, oftentimes it comes in a narrative, non-numerical form, and providing insight into experiences, behaviors, interests, attitudes, and beliefs that teachers, students, or other participants may have. Sometimes they seek out to answer questions that start off with how or why, for example. That could include interviews, focus groups, and even open-ended surveys, for example, questionnaires even. So one example of a qualitative research question could be, how do students engage in online learning activities? Another, why do students choose online learning over traditional face-to-face programs? When we think about the quantitative, on the other hand, that is in the form of numerical or ratio scale data, and that can be quantified and analyzed through the study of statistics. Here is where we draw connections between a number of factors. For example, we could say, what is the relationship between academic achievement and the number of hours spent studying? Or we could say, what are the most influential factors that predict college success? That is looking at a number of factors and even the relationship between one or more factors compared to one another. When we think about these different kinds of methods for quantitative and qualitative, sometimes creating a table to show the differences and nuances is incredibly helpful. So we think about the types of data collection tools. Sometimes they're more standardized versus semi-structured, and oftentimes that aligns itself to a more quantitative or qualitative base, and as well as whether they are close-ended in a quantitative format, such as a Likert scale, 1 to 5, 1 to 4, or they could be more open-ended, in terms of trying to come up with more of an emergent theme per se. The data formats, again, are numeric versus narrative primarily. And then the means in which we can analyze this data set often differs with respect to statistics or more of a content analysis. And there are different types that we can go into later on. And finally, the results of quantitative versus qualitative methods. One is a more descriptive data set that we're going to look at, and another is more exploratory in form. Again, the common methods that we are going to be looking at when we collect quantitative data, one example could be surveys, right? And surveys can be done from either way, but when we collect data through surveys, we can get an idea of a situation or characteristics among particular cases. And oftentimes using a standardized instrument is incredibly helpful towards validity and reliability issues. Oftentimes those standardized instruments come in a closed-ended format, and that can be administered through a number of different ways. The most common today is through an online survey. Secondly, tests, quizzes, and assessments. All these, in terms of quantitative data, are oftentimes standardized, hopefully. If not, then we need to do some kind of pilot testing, ensure that we're actually measuring data in a valid way. And that's going to assess knowledge, skills, or performance-based assessment. These are typically administered pen and paper, but they're going more and more to an online format or electronic format in nature. And programs can also create their own assessments to ensure that they're specifically targeted to their group or their participants with whom they're studying. When we think about qualitative data, on the other hand, we can look at interviews and observations and even focus groups. Those are typically 4 or more people in a focus group, and you can do multiple focus groups even. And then different kinds of document reviews, and that can be existing qualitative data sets. It could be anecdotal records. It could be previous information about student work samples. It could be portfolios. All these sorts of things would fall underneath document review. So we also have to examine the advantages and disadvantages of each of these types of data collection. First, with respect to surveys, it can be quick and efficient, and we can get a lot of data at once, and the responses are relatively easy and straightforward to analyze. However, the disadvantages is that they might not actually be representative of the sample that we seek, and oftentimes they lack in-depth information on a specific topic. And also, people are prone to misunderstand or not understand some questions that we may ask. When it comes to quizzes, assessments, and tests, these are standardized versions, and those are advantages, easy again to compare, and it's relatively objective in nature, although there is some room for discussion with respect to that. And that really goes into the disadvantage listed here at the bottom right of your screen when we talk about they may be biased or oversimplified in nature. With respect to interviews, you can get a pretty good response rate in comparison to surveys because it's typically a direct one-on-one kind of situation, and people are more likely to participate, in fact, if they know you, if they can relate to you on a one-to-one basis. It also allows some flexibility in questions, and you can probe and then go in other places if your questions are emergent in that form. Some of the disadvantages is that it's time consuming to you as a researcher as well as to your participants. And sometimes it's difficult to analyze and compare data because people are so different, especially when you get them talking to you one-on-one. With focus groups, you can collect multiple perspectives in a short duration of time and oftentimes provide greater insight. However, at the same time, it can be time consuming and requiring somebody else to act as a facilitator if you can't be there. And so again, it's more of a time issue. And sometimes being in a group setting, as you know, whether it be a school format or work format, people sometimes are influenced by others in the group. With respect to observations, these can be viewed in real time, which is incredibly helpful. However, sometimes people only remember some aspects of the observation, right? The highlights or the lowlights are the ones that we remember most if we think about our day in general. If we observe a lesson in the field, for example, those are the things that kind of stand out. The things that are more or less normal oftentimes go underneath your radar, even if you're right there. These can also be time consuming and difficult to observe several things going on at once without the use of multiple cameras or other types of data collection devices. And then with document review, here's where the data already exists, so it's easy to access. You can not necessarily interrupt what's going on right now. You can do this in the comfort of your own home or in the library archives or something like that. But it is time consuming and the data is limited to whatever already exists since you won't be creating your own data set. Some things to remember, again, we're trying to combine these by combining elements of qualitative and quantitative research. These data collection tools and strategies are very helpful as standalones, but we're trying to think about ways that we can combine these in unique pairings to be able to suit our research questions and our research agenda. So some things to remember: your evaluation purpose, questions, design, and resources. Those are the things that help determine the best data collection method for your particular evaluation. There's also these common methods that we've talked about today. Feel free to look back at the video there. And that each method distinctly has advantages and disadvantages. So we really want to consider those when thinking about, is a focus group perfect for this research question? How is it better or different or worse than one-on-one interviews or than surveys to teachers, for example? And finally, that a mixed methods approach to your data collection can provide the most comprehensive perspective to a program evaluation or a study in general. And so that's my perspective. I hope you have gleaned some information from this PowerPoint discussion on data collection methods across quantitative and qualitative fields. I wish you all the best in your research.
So that was super helpful in understanding how to collect data. Now, in terms of mixed method research, we haven't really gotten into that, but that's basically a combination of your quantitative and qualitative research combined. Now, keep in mind there are strengths to this. It definitely uses a mixture of both types of study in that it uses a mixture of words, pictures, narrative, numbers, which adds more meaning to your research findings. It can offer stronger evidence for research conclusion. It can complement the strengths and weaknesses both in quantitative and qualitative studies, and it's more complete and generalized in terms of your research results. It definitely, in terms of weaknesses, is more complex to carry out. It's definitely more work. More time consuming, it's more intense in terms of collecting data and resources. And you do have a little bit of conflict in risks in terms of conflicting research from both your different types of study, quantitative and qualitative. In another video, I'm going to show you there's a professor who does get into why it actually might not be good to do a mixed method research, but there are advantages for sure. So here's a review of what mixed method research questions would look like.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Health 2250 class on mixed methods. The objectives for this particular class are as follows. I'm hoping that you'll gain an understanding of the purpose of mixed methods research. You already have the skill of being able to identify differences between quant and qual research and to appraise those research processes. So that's a piece of information you already have to build on. I want you to be able to describe different approaches or rationales for mixed methods research. We're going to talk about sampling, issues with data collection and data analysis, talk a little bit about appraising credibility and integrity, and lastly, identify opportunities for mixed methods research in nursing. So I have a couple of definitions here around what is mixed methods research. It really is, pardon me, a research approach where There's a systematic combination of the collection and analysis of both qualitative and quantitative data within the same study. So they're not sequential studies or separate studies. It's all within the same study. And the researcher or investigator collects and analyzes that data, and the goal is to somehow integrate the findings to draw sort of inferences or conclusions from both the qual and the quantitative approaches. So if we revisit the research continuum, we've looked at this before. We have qualitative on the your far right as you're looking at this PowerPoint slide, the naturalistic paradigm. And then on the far left, we have the quantitative or the positivistic paradigm. And both those paradigms have very different worldviews and values and beliefs, which we looked at previously. So mixed methods, a little bit of yin and yang as it shows in the picture, but we want to combine those two worldviews within one study. So there's lots of different reasons why we might think about that. I'm going to refer you to the article by Tarek and Woodman. I posted the reading under our pre-class learning. It is an excellent, really easy to follow article on mixed methods. And so they address 5 different sort of reasons or rationale for using mixed methods. And the first one is complementarity, and it's using data obtained by one method to illustrate results from another method, often to dive more deeply or thoroughly. And so an example of this would be a survey of adolescents with epilepsy who are demonstrating poor levels of medication adherence. Often this occurs in adolescents. And semi-structured interviews with a subgroup of those surveyed could allow researchers to explore barriers to adherence. So initially they were surveyed, and then they went on to do semi-structured interviews. Development is another rationale they present. And this is where we use results from one method to develop or inform the use of another method. So this might be using a focus group to develop a questionnaire, or using a survey to explore more deeply in a focus group. So an example of this would be a focus group conducted with a group of adolescents with epilepsy. Has identified mobile phone technology as a potentially important tool in improving medication adherence and support. And so then the researchers could then use a mobile app that reminds the patients to take their medication and conduct an intervention study to assess the impact on adherence levels. Initiation is using results from different methods specifically to look for areas of incongruence or disagreement in order to generate sort of new and deeper insights. And here often it helps to explain sort of contradictory findings. For example, we do a survey or questionnaire, we have contradictory findings, we need to dive deeper to figure out what those are. So an illustration of this would be a study exploring the discrepancy between reported medication adherence in clinic consultations face-to-face around medication adherence and what is actually happening as far as medication adherence. So a review of case notes may find adherence levels of over 90% in a clinic population. However, semi-structured interviews with peer researchers may reveal much lower levels of adherence. But then we could explore barriers to medication adherence in an open discussion with clinicians. Expansion is setting out to examine different aspects of a research question where each aspect warrants different methods. So an example of this would be we may wish to conduct a study that explores adherence as a broad concept, medication adherence as a broad concept. A large-scale survey of adolescents with epilepsy would provide information on adherence levels and associations, while interviews and focus groups may allow us to engage with individual experiences of living with the chronic illness and medication adherence, specifically in the developmental stage of adolescence. And lastly, something we've explored previously is this notion of triangulation, where we use data obtained by both methods to corroborate on findings. So if both methods are pointing to the same outcomes or findings, that often strengthens our research study. So could be using more than one source of data or method in the same study to explain or explore health-related concerns or curiosities. So for example, we could conduct a clinical study measuring drug levels in adolescents with epilepsy and also have them document their self-reported adherence. And then qualitative methods such as a diary may be able to confirm those adherence levels. In summary, in relation to those five rationales for using mixed methods, the important thing to think about is all the justifications offered really point to this underlying notion that mixed methods can offer a richer explanation than just the sole use of quantitative or qualitative research methods, drawing on the strengths of each approach and overcoming the weaknesses of each approach. Now, what's really important, though, is that it is the research question that drives the choice of method. And so we need to reflect back on the research question and how best it is to attain data to be able to answer that. So one thing I propose to you is to think about what do you think a mixed methods research question will look like? What features of the research question would make the researcher think that they actually needed to use a mixed method approach to answer their question? So I want you to think about a curiosity you have from your clinical practice where you think mixed methods might work best. And I've created a discussion board, and I welcome you to post that on our discussion board for an additional 2% bonus marks, which I would add to your final grade. So it needs to be robust, it needs to have value, it's not just one sentence. So think about that, and I welcome you to comment on each other's posts as well. So something to think about in relation to mixed method design, there's 3 specific dimensions we need to consider. The first one is weighting of the quant and the qual pieces. And a lot of times this can be influenced by worldview, the positivistic versus the naturalistic paradigm. It can be influenced by the researcher's skills, and it can be influenced by resources such as time and money. So we might have an equal weight between quant and qual, or we might have one method weighted more heavily. Timing is another aspect we're going to dive into a little deeper in a couple future slides, but we need to think about the timing of the quant and qual. So are they going to run concurrently? We're collecting data in both paradigms simultaneously, Or is it going to be sequential, where we might collect the quant first, and then that analysis might inform the second phase, which is the qual phase. And the third dimension to consider is the mixing of the quant and qual methods in relation to data analysis. And this is probably the greatest challenge in mixed method research, and we're going to talk about that coming up. So just a little picture of what concurrent mixed methods might look like. We have our quantitative data collection on the left, we have our qualitative data collection on the right, and those results might be compared and contrasted to be able to answer our research question. And so I'm providing you an example here of a concurrent study where Lahana and McNeil conducted a study to determine how parents, both English and Spanish speaking, understand medical care provided to their child and the procedural and consent forms that are required. So they had a 36-item questionnaire that required numerical responses like a Likert scale, and it measured comprehension and ability to read and understand medical information. And as well, then they conducted focus groups and individual interviews concurrently. So the qualitative analysis enriched the quantitative results, hence strengthening the research. The second approach is sequential. So you can see working left to right, this example has the quantitative phase first. We have our research question development. We do our quant data collection analysis. We have our quant results. And then out of those results, we develop interview questions that we might want to probe deeper on. And we collect our qual data, we analyze it, and we have qual results. And then the challenge is the integration of those quant results and the qual results. I actually conducted a sequential study, not in relation to healthcare, but in relation to teaching learning strategy. I developed a quantitative non-experimental survey that my students conducted within the last 2 weeks of class, evaluating the innovative teaching strategy I had used. And then the results of that survey informed questions that I then posed to focus groups to be able to dive deeper. Some of the results that came out of the quant survey was that students really experienced a lot of benefits and advantages. They experienced what they call deeper learning, more motivation to come to class to learn. And so I really wanted to probe that deeper within the focus groups. So another example of a sequential study is Farrell and Rose investigated whether personal digital assistants, or PDAs, would enhance or help nursing students' pharmacological and clinical context knowledge. It was a quasi-experimental design. The intervention group students received PDAs and the control group did not. Both groups were tested beforehand and on completion. And then after, focus group interviews explored issues related to the use of the PDA and how that influenced students' pharmacological learning. Just to touch on sampling in mixed methods, it can be a challenge because each method has its own assumptions and goals, but most mixed method studies draw only one sample. So for the quantitative piece, it might be probability sampling. We know in quant, probability sampling can enhance generalizability, and we can do a specific power calculation to reduce type 2 errors. But sometimes we also draw a convenient sample in quantitative research, especially non-experimental or survey type research. And thirdly, sometimes we might use purposive sampling, where we select information-rich cases or individuals or participants who are good informants. And some mixed method studies might use something we term sequential sampling, which is very much like theoretical sampling used in qualitative grounded theory, where we interview a few people and then the results of those interviews inform our choices of future participants. Data analysis can be a significant challenge, and I alluded to this earlier. It's about when and how to merge and integrate the data. So it could be simultaneously, but separately, with integration as an interpretive process where the findings are compared and contrasted and combined. So it could be simultaneously, but it could be sequentially where subsequent analyses build on previous findings. Or it could be concurrently where one analysis is embedded in the other. And this is the article by Tarek talks about this, where we qualify quant data and quantify qual data. I'm not going to get into the depth or extent of that any further. I don't expect you to have a huge understanding of that, but just to know that sometimes when reading a mixed methods research article, you might see that. So questions to ask yourself when you're looking at a mixed methods research study. Why was mixed method design used in this study? What philosophical stance did the researchers take? What are the benefits and the drawbacks of taking this particular stance? Was it more heavily weighted, quantitative or qualitative? What emphasis of method did the researchers adopt? Was it more heavily emphasized on quant with a little bit of qual follow-up, or vice versa? And what time dimension did the researchers utilize and why? Was it concurrent? Was it sequential? And what might have been some of the rationale behind that? So when we look at appraising mixed methods research, we are going to go back to the skills that you've already learned in appraising quantitative research and qualitative. You could possibly use the templates we used and use those separately for each of the particular designs. So once again, we need to establish the suitability of the design. Going back to the research question, we want to assess the qual and the quant elements by their respective standards of rigor. And you know how to do that. And we want to assess the relationship between quant and qual elements of the study and how that relationship kind of contributed to the findings of the study. When we look at the philosophy of combining quant and qual, there's sort of two approaches. The first one is known as the incompatibility theory, and you can see the little tug-of-war going on. Some researchers live solely in the quantitative or the qualitative domain, and never the two shall meet. And those researchers would be very unlikely to complete mixed methods research. But the other domain is pragmatism, and this is the view that recognizes the strengths and weaknesses of both paradigms, understanding the paradigm as a continuum, and appreciating the values that they both bring to a research study. So I've included here a couple different examples of mixed methods research. I've basically modified the abstract and cut and pasted it here, but it does give you an appreciation for some examples of mixed methods research in healthcare specifically. This first one, Back on Track, a longitudinal mixed method study on the rehabilitation of young adult cancer survivors. And they sort of simultaneously collected data via questionnaires, physical testing, and interviews at 4 separate time points, hensing the longitudinal design, and then put all those dimensions together to really paint a thorough picture of what that rehabilitation process looked like. And the second study is an interesting study looking at gender differences in psychosocial and medical outcomes stemming from testing positive for the genetic mutation for breast cancer. And here they looked at both men and women, and they used a combination of the quant and the qual to really be able to refine what that kind of outcome was in relation to that diagnosis.
So this was super helpful in really explaining mixed methods, but again, you have to really be careful about, choosing the right method for your particular research question. And this is why we're going to really try to format your PICO questions today. This particular professor, I love what he talks about. It's a short video, but I really want you to understand why you wouldn't want to use mixed method research. He goes more into the reasons of not to use it and gives you really good examples. So just take a look at this, and we're going to be breaking out into groups soon.
Well, welcome to Mixed Methods Research and Overview. I'm Joe Gogler, long-term care professor in nursing and director of graduate studies in the Center on Aging here at the University of Minnesota. And now we're turning to part 2 of our overview of mixed methods and really trying to answer the question, why use mixed methods? In what circumstances or situations would mixed methods best be applied? And again, much of this material is derived from the overview of best practices for mixed methods research in health sciences, published by Cresswell and colleagues in 2010. So here I am providing some rationales for why we would want to use, or why we'd consider using mixed methods. And building off of the 2010 publication, I'm providing some additional background based on Cresswell and Plano-Clark's 2011 text as well. And let's work through each of these. First, a need exists because one data source may be insufficient. So there may be cases where, for whatever reasons and based on the question an investigator has, that simply utilizing a purely quantitative empirical method may not get at issues related to process, or issues related to how or why something is working, or issues related to context. Vice versa, qualitative strands may not be able to provide sufficient information as to, say, replicability, issues related to effectiveness or efficacy, issues related to, say, patterns of findings and results, et cetera. And there are many other probably justifications we can use to determine and identify why, say, one type of method or methodology isn't necessarily sufficient. If that's the case, then the rationale for mixed methods is made clearer. Second, a need exists to explain initial results. And again, I think this is another powerful rationale for why one would want to conduct mixed methods. It could be, for example, say I conduct a randomized control trial, and for whatever reasons, my intervention doesn't show any effectiveness or efficacy. Well, why is that? Now, certainly I could maybe look at some key variables within the randomized control design that I had collected that could potentially explain lack of benefit. But there may be also a need to actually ask people who participated, why didn't this work for you? What were the reasons why? And that certainly could identify additional reasons as to why the intervention may or may not have worked, but then maybe even get at to issues related to mechanisms or processes of benefit or lack thereof too. So again, I mean, that could be one potential example for needing to explain initial results. Another reason as to why one would want to consider using mixed methods is to generalize exploratory findings. So again, say one starting with a focus group, one is utilizing some type of qualitative method in the field, and maybe starts to identify really intriguing patterns. For example, I'm working with a colleague, Tatiana Shippey, in the School of Public Health here at the University of Minnesota, and she's doing a really interesting, complex mixed method study on health disparities and health equity in nursing homes in Minnesota and throughout the U.S. And so she began by doing some really in-depth interviewing of residents. And one thing she's found that's been very interesting, and she's focused particularly her interviewing on those of diverse ethnic or racial origin in these nursing homes. And one of the things she's found that's been very interesting, that really has run counter to some of the empirical research I've done myself, is she's noted that many of these residents have no visiting family members. No family members are visiting them at all or anything along those lines. And so one of the things that we're hoping to do in subsequent empirical survey work is to really determine, is that the case? Is that actually occurring, that these residents, number one, don't have family members aren't visiting, and more, perhaps most importantly, is this lack of family engagement impacting overall quality of life or quality of care in these nursing homes that serve diverse populations? That to me is a good example of the need to explain initial results and why mixed methods is powerful. Now, certainly in some cases it may be the mixed methods design is not necessarily an a priori design, such as the case of Dr. Shippey's study. It may be we as investigators are in the field and conducting some type of study, again, utilizing, say, ethnographic methods, grounded theory, et cetera, and then the results we obtain then lead us to perhaps conduct some follow-up empirical/quantitative types of analyses or designs. That could be another example, too, of the need to explain initial results. And certainly it can be vice versa as well when conducting empirical quantitative research, say survey-related data, understanding why certain results emerged the way they did in an initial strand. Fourth here is, third, which is similar to the second, a need exists to generalize exploratory findings. I think it's similar to the second point. Again, when we're talking about exploratory findings, again, exploratory doesn't necessarily always mean qualitative. It can mean quantitative as well. But the need to utilize an additional method to perhaps explain what we have found in exploratory analyses. And maybe that also leads to the creation of, if this is what one is interested in, hypotheses per se. Fourth, a need exists to enhance a study with a second method. Similar to the first point, by utilizing this subsequent method or concurrent method, it more or less enhances the overall study and what the study will generate. Again, I really want to emphasize here, and we talked about this in the first module to some extent, is much of this should be driven by question. If the question requires or will be best addressed and answered by multiple methods, then that certainly is an instance and offers a strong rationale for an investigator to use mixed methods. Again, I don't think it's sufficient to simply say, well, it's basically adding one method to another, and by doing so, by adding both together, we'll automatically have something better. Or kind of falling to this, what I think is a somewhat lazy rationale in that qualitative and quantitative combined are better than one or the other. It's not necessarily the case, particularly, again, depending on one's question. A need exists to best employ a theoretical stance. Certain theories are very amenable to mixed methods, and in fact, maybe can best be tested, best can be understood in utilizing mixed methods to understand, for example, how certain constructs evolve, how certain constructs are related to each other. Again, I think that's a potentially strong rationale for why mixed methods can be used or required. Also, a need exists to understand a research study through multiple research phases. Certainly, there are many instances where one is engaged or involved in a large-scale type of initiative, say a large-scale program evaluation. And it may be required that in order to evaluate this given program, it's not going to happen within the context of a singular study. It actually will occur over multiple phases, maybe even multiple years, that then do require multiple methods to best understand, is this program working? Perhaps can this program best influence policy, et cetera. Again, in those cases, a use of a mixed methods design may be appropriate if not desired. We've alluded to this a little bit in the prior slide, but really, again, why do we use mixed methods? Being driven by the research question. And Certainly there is divergence within the mixed methodological literature where some believe that sometimes the research question shouldn't necessarily drive the methods we employ. I think Cresswell certainly believes that is the case. I do as well. That one's question should be utilized to more or less, whether it's question, hypotheses, etc., that is what should be used to guide what one's methods are and what one's methodological framework is. There are many, many cases that I have experienced both myself, but then also when advising, say, graduate students or other fellow colleagues and scholars, where the question posed is not necessarily amenable to mixed methods, and that's fine. If mixed methods aren't required or needed, to be quite frank, it's probably advisable, in many cases is a good outcome, to not use them then. As opposed to saying, well, mixed methods are great, I'm very excited by doing that, and I'm going to do them regardless of what my question is or above and beyond what my question is. And in fact, the resources required to conduct mixed methods effectively, both in terms of people power, both in terms of time, and often cases financial resources, are such that if one can answer a question within a singular type of methodology or method, then that is probably the best outcome for all involved. Second, contextualize information or provide multi-level perspectives. So again, there are many instances where we can conduct multi-level research utilizing one type of method per se, or say a series of quantitative and or qualitative methods. But this is also usually an exciting opportunity to utilize mixed methods as well. Say one particular unit of analysis is the individual, and let's say the researcher chooses to apply a strictly quantitative approach when studying individual factors per se, but then the researcher may also be interested in gaining a better contextual understanding for where these individuals are part of, or what these individuals are part of. And those contextual analyses or those contextual methods may better align themselves with more of a qualitative approach, whether it's ethnography or something similar. So again, utilizing mixed methods as a way to better understand multiple levels of influence to answer a given question is another very strong rationale for why one would consider adopting this approach. The issue of triangulation, utilizing different methods to determine if similar patterns emerge, similar constructs are defined, regardless of method, utilizing triangulation to actually achieve that, or utilizing mixed methods to actually achieve effective triangulation. I mean, that's another potential good example for why one would want to use mixed methods. And then finally, understanding of process. Again, one is not necessarily precluded from understanding process if one utilizes either quantitative or qualitative methods solely. But sometimes applying, for example, qualitative methods to better understand the process of why or how a given intervention worked, for example, or why or how given statistical patterns are emerging in a quantitative strand can be another powerful reason for why one would want to use mixed methods. So again, in conclusion here to part 2, I wanted to refer you to 2 key readings that we've cited in these slides, particularly these 2 Cresswell readings. Cresswell's 2010 publication and then Cresswell's 2011 textbook. I found these very, very helpful, very, very foundational for me to better understand why one would want to use mixed methods.
So I found this video pretty helpful. I like what he points out is that mixed methods is a great tool. However, it's not necessarily the best option. You definitely have to look at your question to determine what research type you're going to do. So again, to just compare the different approaches, we have quantitative versus qualitative versus mixed. So the nature of the data in quantitative are your variables. Remember, it's quantitative, so we want to look at numbers. Mixed methods would be a mix of variables, words, and images, whereas qualitative is words, images, categories, and patterns, okay? Data analysis within quantitative data is based on statistical relationships versus qualitative. You're looking for a search for patterns, themes, and holistic features. And in mixed methods, you have a little bit of both in terms of quantitative symptoms and qualitative support. The results in quantitative, you're generalizing versus qualitative, you're finding particular findings, like a representation of insider viewpoints. In the mixed methods, we're doing corroborated findings, which may end up generalizing things. And in the final report form of your quantitative data, you're looking at statistical reports versus qualitative. You need narrative even with direct quotations of research participants. So hopefully this was helpful because now we're going to break down your question in both quantitative and qualitative format. And based on your PICO questions and your peer review, you're going to both collaborate with your group members to determine which study, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, or mixed, would be best served for your particular research. This is very important to really talk to your group members because you really want to get the best outcomes from your particular research. So make sure you really think about this and get feedback from your peers. We're also going to be creating proposals for your particular research project to get participants to actually want to participate in your research project. So we'll give you a template for that and to create that so you have a proposal to introduce what you're doing to your participants so they actually have an idea of, why they're doing what they're doing and what kind of impact it may have for future, other patients. All right, thank you and good luck.